or giving comments, or basically just discussing. So, but without much further ado, I would like to introduce you to Gurminder Bhambra, who is taking the time to join us today from Sussex in the UK, where she's Professor of Post and Decolonial Studies at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. And her research interests are primarily on post-colonial and global historical sociology. She most recently focuses on epistemological justice and reparations. And beyond her many engagement as editor of different journals and book series, she has also set up the very fantastic website of Global Social Theory, which I, if you don't know it already, strongly recommend, where different resources for students, for teachers, for academics are collected and made available from a global perspective and not just from the Eurocentric perspective we know. So today, Gurminder will speak to us on undoing the epistemic disavowal of the Haitian Revolution, and we look forward to that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, let me just share my PowerPoint with you. Okay, so great. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about Haiti and having the discussion afterwards as well. So I guess where I want to start really is the fact that when we talk about democratic revolutions within the world historical revolutions that are said to have brought about democracy, the standard narratives that are presented are usually those of the United States, and then thinking about the French Revolution. And these revolutions are most often cited within the social sciences and within sort of standard accounts of the emergence of the modern world as being foundational events that were organized around new understandings of equality and involved the transformation of social hierarchies. So the idea of this shift from feudalism to modern society is seen to be central to these revolutions. Now, partly the issue is that when we talk about these two revolutions, one of the things that we rarely talk about is the fact that the franchise within both of them was restricted effectively to propertied white men, and the dispossession of indigenous peoples and enslavement of populations that was central to both the US example as well as the French Revolution are often not engaged with. And so in that sense, the question would have to be asked is, A, to what extent were these radical revolutions in their own terms, given the example of the Haitian Revolution, which we could sit alongside it? So if we were to take Haiti seriously, we would have to understand that it had a much more radical vision and radical politics, and occurred at pretty much the same sort of time as the US and French revolutions, and yet is very rarely presented as part of a triumvirate of revolutions. It's always the US and the French, and to the extent that authors do engage with Haiti, Haiti is seen to be a revolution that happens afterwards and in response to these two revolutions. Now, I've put up a couple of images of books that engage with this idea of the modern world and indeed seek to engage with it in terms of a global understanding of how we might think about the world coming about. You've got C.A. Bailey's The Birth of the Modern World, in which he actually has on the front cover an image of an enslaved person from Haiti, somebody who had freed themselves and then gone and argued in the Constituent Assembly in France to argue for the end of slavery. And yet, despite having him on the cover, Haiti and the Haitian Revolution doesn't really merit extensive treatment in Bailey's discussion of how the modern world came into being. Similarly with Osterhammel, who's written a much more extensive book, possibly I think it's around 600 pages or something, even there Haiti only gets a very short engagement. And the engagement that it has doesn't actually talk about the radical nature of the Haitian Revolution, or how, if we were to take our understandings of Haiti seriously, how they might actually affect the standard narratives that we otherwise present of the ways in which the French and US revolutions were said to have brought the modern world into being. Now, obviously, there are notable exceptions to this. C.L.R. James, who's writing over half a century previously, highlights the importance of what he calls the Black Jacobins, and this book was one of the first really to bring to international attention the events in Saint-Domingue that come to be known as the Haitian Revolution. I guess one thing perhaps also to say at this point is that it's not necessarily that C.L.R. James is the first person to write about Haiti, but this book certainly is significant in bringing it to a broader audience. But there is an aspect, you know, there are earlier scholars, Anna Julia Cooper, for example, who was an African-American woman who did her PhD at the Sorbonne and wrote about the relationship between the French and Haitian revolutions. And she writes about this in the early 20th century, so before C.L.R. James has published his book. And so it's interesting also to think about these different aspects of silencing that go on. So just to say a little bit about the Haitian Revolution, because what I want to try and get across in the half hour that I'm talking to is really what might we learn about the birth of the modern world and its transformation if we were to start from the Haitian Revolution. So what was the Haitian Revolution? Just briefly to say something about, if you like, the facts of the case. We have Santo Domingo, as it was known in Spanish, or Saint-Domingue in French. This was an island, it's noted there on the map, and it had been both French and Spanish colony. It ends up being predominantly French by the time we're interested in it, which is late 18th, early 19th century. And at the time of the French Revolution, Saint-Domingue was the most profitable part of the French Empire. Its raw materials such as sugar, cotton, coffee were grown on plantations within Saint-Domingue, and these were worked by enslaved Africans who were brought there as part of the European trade in human beings. A third of the commodities were consumed within France, with the rest being exported back to Saint-Domingue, which then becomes also, so it's not only the place of the production of the raw materials of empire, but it's also one of the largest markets for France in terms of selling then the commodities that are produced. By the close of the 18th century, there's over 500,000 enslaved Africans living on the island, and also a sizable population of free Africans and freed peoples of colour, so people who've either self-emancipated or been freed through a variety of reasons. Now, conditions in Saint-Domingue were harsh. They were harsher than similar sorts of conditions across much of the Americas, and the population in Saint-Domingue has to be reproduced through the importation of increasing numbers of enslaved people. One of the things that means is that the population in Saint-Domingue has a much lower percentage of people who are actually born into slavery, and has a population that was born free, then captured and brought over. That means that they have particular sorts of knowledges and experiences that they bring with them across from their original countries of origin that they're bringing across then to Saint-Domingue. So during the late 1800s, or during the late 18th century, sorry, there's increasing unrest at the harsh regime that's being enacted in Saint-Domingue. And that leads to a decade or more of uprisings, revolts, rebellions that are going on within the island against the conditions of enslavement and arguing for self-emancipation. So what you have is a situation in which the population rises up against the colonizers, and C.L.R. James credits Toussaint Louverture with sort of organizing the population into becoming a military force, because remember, these people are not necessarily trained as soldiers, but his capacity as a general is such that he's able to mobilize the population and organize them in order to defeat European troops. So Toussaint has no military background, but James states, and I'm quoting here, he incarnated the determination of his people never, never to be slaves again. And even after his arrest and deportation, he had laid the grounds for perhaps one of the most significant political victories with the defeat of European troops by, by people who had been enslaved upon the island. Now, in achieving their independence, so once the French and British troops had been defeated, the people who decided to assert sovereignty on the island, one of their first acts was to name the state Haiti, because as I said, it had been called Saint-Domingue, and they decide to name it Haiti. And in part, they name it Haiti to honor the Arawak Taino people who had lived on the island prior to French and Spanish colonization and who had been wiped out by those processes of colonization. So I think it's quite extraordinary that the first act of the new state is precisely to honor the people who had lived there prior to them. They also establish a constitution, and in the constitution, I think one of the things that's quite extraordinary about it is that the idea of citizenship that is enacted within the constitution is an idea that has far greater universal applicability than any other form of citizenship that is in existence at that time. And its understandings of freedom are also much greater than the understandings of freedom that have been set out in either the French or the US revolutions. So Haiti is the first republic to be based on the freedom of all its population and to be organized around a notion of blackness that represented the political commitment of a population opposed to colonization and enslavement. So in the US and in France, both of them maintained a racialized understanding of the political sphere in which only propertied white men were able to vote. Haiti, however, made color no bar to political participation. Now you might see within the excerpts of the Constitution that I've put on the PowerPoint that they talk about Haitians being Black. And they talk also about how no white man of whatever nation shall put his foot on this territory. But they qualify that no white man of whatever nation shall put his foot on this territory with the title of master or proprietor. And so in a sense, they're making an explicit argument for citizenship to be understood as the investment of all with the success of the state, and those who wish to colonize it are understood as white. So I don't think that the terms Black or white within the Constitution are associated with the color of one's epidermis, but it was a political understanding between colonizer and colonized. And you can see that in the way in which they talk about the fact that women who could be said to be white but were on the island were not understood to be white, but were understood to be incorporated within citizens of the island. And similarly with Germans and Polish people who had been brought over in a system of indenture previously were also not understood as white because they weren't there as colonizers. And so by making freedom from enslavement and racial discrimination the bedrock of political understandings, what the Haitians do through this constitution, I would suggest, is that they de-link citizenship from race. And they also radicalize and universalize the idea of equality. So at the time that the revolutionary leaders are calling for the immediate and universal abolition of slavery in Haiti, this isn't a call that exists in the US or in France in any similar sort of way. So this is really quite a radical moment, particularly when we think about the ways in which both the US and French revolutions sort of ensue. You know, the US maintains a slave society for at least another 100 years, and then maintains a system of formal segregation where African Americans are only given the right to vote by the late 20th century. And similarly in France, it maintains segregation by race in terms of citizenship. It maintains its colonies, and Algeria doesn't get its independence till the late 20th century. So both the US and France maintain systems of segregation and racialized exclusion from citizenship for almost 200 years after this moment by Haiti. Now, in this sense, the revolution that Haiti sort of constitutes was such a powerful moment that we also have to then ask, why is it that we don't, or that many of us don't know about Haiti, and certainly are perhaps not taught about Haiti as being a democratic revolution on par with the US and France? I mean, I would argue it's more extensive, but nonetheless, it's not even included within the revolutions that are said to make the modern world. And so here we get to the issue of, well, how does that silencing actually manifest itself materially? And one of the first things is that France immediately puts a blockade on Haiti and refuses to trade with Haiti, and refuses to allow Britain, the US, or other European countries to trade with Haiti. So from what I was saying at the very beginning, that this island had produced the most wealth for the French Empire, from that position of being so wealthy, but the wealth being appropriated by France, it goes to a situation within 20 years of being completely bankrupt. Because nobody trades with Haiti, Haiti isn't able to sell any of its commodities, and so goes bankrupt. So in the 1820s, a delegation from the Haitian government goes to France to ask for the lifting of sanctions. France agrees to lift sanctions, but only in return, only if Haiti promises to recompense it for all the property that it lost through the revolution. And Haiti had, the government has no option but to do this, so it allows the French government to send auditors to Haiti in order to put a value on all the property that had been lost. They come, they value the land, the buildings, and also the people, because the people had been enslaved, and as being enslaved, they were deemed to be property. So in emancipating themselves, it was deemed that they had stolen themselves from the French. And the figure that was calculated in terms of how much Haiti had to pay France included also the value of the human beings who were there. So France asks for 150 million gold francs, and this is in 1825. Just to put this into some sort of context, when after the Haitian Revolution and Haiti comes out of French control, France is under Napoleon at the time and is fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and it also needs money to be fighting these wars, and so it needs money quickly. So one of the things it does is that it sells Louisiana. Now Louisiana is a state in the US, but at the time it was much bigger than the geographical form that it currently has. It goes from north of Canada to south of Mexico, so it was the entire middle of the US. It sells this, and obviously these are all in highly inverted quotation marks, because we can also talk about what right the French had to possess Louisiana in the first place. But nonetheless, it sells it to the fledgling United States for 80 million gold francs. So the whole center of the US is sold for 80 million gold francs, and what they're asking from Haiti is 150 million gold francs. Haiti has to pay this coerced indemnity over the next century, and by 1922, which is when I think it was repaid, or certainly by the middle of the 20th century, the amount of money was equivalent to 21 billion US dollars. So when people talk now about, oh, well, Haiti's a failed state, Haiti doesn't have infrastructure, it doesn't, you know, all these sorts of things. We can only imagine that if this 21 billion US dollars had been pumped into Haiti instead of being given to France, what difference that might make to issues of development in Haiti as opposed to development in France. So you could say that the welfare state in France, infrastructure in France, has been funded through the labor and taxes of people in Haiti, and that a significant aspect of France's continuing prosperity is dependent on this, and Haiti's poverty is dependent on this. And as Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who's one of the key figures in having written about the Haitian Revolution in his book Silencing the Past, the event which was unthinkable at the time becomes over time a non-event. So what he's referring to there is that within the European Enlightenment thinkers of the time, the Haitian Revolution was unthinkable. It was unthinkable that enslaved Africans could enact such a world historical event, such that they just did not consider it. And in not considering it then, over time, through our failure to consider it, it's as if it didn't happen. And so that silence is something that was created materially through France's sanctions upon Haiti, but then is also perpetuated epistemologically through our failure both to think about the Haitian Revolution and to think about the significance of it. And what I want to sort of end with here, and then we can have more of a conversation about it, is that it's not just that we should know about the Haitian Revolution. I mean, I think we should. I think it's an extraordinary event in human history, and there is so much more to say than I've been able to say in these brief moments about the event itself. And there are histories that have been written about this that we can read. And there's also something else, particularly for those of us within the social sciences. The question is to ask what difference would be made to our understandings of social scientific concepts and categories if we included the Haitian Revolution within our understandings. So to give you one brief example, when we, and I say we as sort of academics or social scientists, think about concepts of citizenship, we often think about them in terms of the French Revolution. That's presented as the paradigmatic case of the emergence of the modern political system, of democracy, and the idea of citizens that's then associated with that. And thinking about citizenship as a universal category associated with the French Revolution, when we then think about issues in the present that might challenge particular understandings of that form of citizenship, those challenges are often presented in terms of identity politics. So if we think about France, again, issues of race are often thought to have come about in the late 20th century, and race is seen to be something that then distorts the universal concepts of citizenship that are seen to have emerged from the modern republic and been formed sort of properly in that sense. But if we just go back a little bit and think about the way in which citizenship was actually formed during the French Revolution, one of the things that we realize is that race was a central part of the discussions of the French deputies in the Constituent Assembly in the period immediately after the French Revolution. So there was a conversation that happens within the Constituent Assembly that asks whether free men, or only free men, can be citizens, or whether freed men could also be citizens. So pointing to the question of whether, if you had been enslaved, whether it was possible for you then to become a citizen. And in 1792, an act was passed that said, yes, freed men could also be citizens, and that citizenship should be extended to those who had been enslaved. And so in part, this was a consequence of what was happening in Saint-Domingue at the time, and a consideration that whilst the French Revolution had addressed many hierarchies, it had not addressed what was called the aristocracy of the skin. And as such, when a delegation from Haiti, from Saint-Domingue, came to Paris and argued in front of the Constituent Assembly for the abolition of slavery, the three people, there was Mills, who was known at the time as, in the language of the time, as a mulatto. There was Dufay, a white man, and Bellet, who was a formerly enslaved person who had bought his own liberty through labor in his own time. The three of them walked into the Constituent Assembly and put forward an argument for the abolition of slavery and for the establishment of equality. And the Constituent Assembly erupted, according to CLR James, and said that, that we declare slavery to be abolished in all the colonies, and we declare that all men, without distinction of colour, are French citizens. So this is in 1792, or 1794, sorry, 1794. Within 2 years, within 18 months actually, this act is reversed. So after the delegates leave, people in France and Paris continue to have these conversations, and within 18 months they reverse the decree and decide that actually black men can't be citizens. So when we talk about citizenship as an abstract universal, and we think that it was formed without reference to race, we miss out on this, and we miss out on this key episode. What we do is pretend that something is universal, when in fact, when we examine it historically, we understand how it's racialized. So citizenship as it emerged in the French Republic was racialized from its very beginnings because they considered race and decided that that citizenship ought to be racialized. So our universal understanding of citizenship is not universal, it's racialized, but we act as if it's universal and then think about race as somehow distorting its current understandings. And so for me, the significance of, or the need to take Haiti seriously, and many other such instances of history, is not just in their own terms. It's also about what taking these instances of history seriously then does for our ability to transform the social sciences to make them more adequate for our times and for the futures to come. So perhaps I'll leave it there, and I've also got a list of references of people whose work I've used to present the arguments that I've been presenting here today.
Thank you, Gurminder. Yeah, I think we have a lot to discuss here, and I'm particularly happy that that you bring up the relevance of the Haitian Revolution, because in fact it is almost always neglected in any kind of discussions, both in terms of development, but also in terms of general social theory, as you rightly say. So I want to open the floor to everyone to give their comments and views or questions, maybe. So feel free. You have the opportunity to unmute yourself if you want to. Otherwise, you can also put a question in the chat box. So, Lata, you want to go first?
I don't have to, but I will, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
So, firstly, to say, wonderful to actually have a chance to virtually meet you. Thank you for a great talk. And I should say up front that it's been very inspiring. And between your podcast and this, I'm going to share, I don't teach on the level 1 Making of the Modern World module, but I've got some really good resources to share with them. So that's my job when we finish here. So thank you for that. I hope that's all right. I'm actually really interested. Well, there's 2 things you said that I just think, I'm wondering if you had more thoughts about, really, because I know it's obviously you've only got half an hour. But first, obviously, what you described about Haiti's buyout obviously mirrors what happened in the UK with the compensation of the slave owners. And I wasn't sure if you know if there, whether you've done or if there is comparative work about that. It just seems like an obvious gap, because I have to say I'm coming to all that information new, and I'm finding it quite shocking that how can you not talk, we talk about bailouts and we're not talking about, and so in a way there is that literature, Rodney sort of talking about, industrialization, industrial revolution happening on the backs of that slave labor. I wonder if you had a thought about how maybe we need to also talk about the way those buyouts, so this isn't even about extracting the surplus from labor in a way, it's actually extracting the value of the human being itself that has then led to the contemporary imbalance and the subsequent poverty. It's not even like you could say, well, I didn't pay the labor. It's like, actually, you've extracted my value, or the value as a human being, which seems in a way worse and insidious and not acknowledged at all. So that was the first kind of question, whether you had thoughts or literature, whether you've written about that. And the other thing was this question of racialized citizenship, I think is really important. I'd come across Mary Beard talking about this in the context of Roman citizenship. I don't know that argument very well, but she sort of seems to suggest if you bought into Rome, then race was less important. She's taken some pushback on that. But Haiti seems to be really interesting in thinking about a kind of a modernity that is not like a modern form of citizenship that's not racialized. And maybe if you had any other examples of that, or if you've written about that, I also think that's really interesting, because part of the challenge is to think about what a post-racialized world would, what would a world without race as a dividing line look like? What would those articles of foundation look like? So that's all, that thinking about the future, it seems so important, and this seems like a really important thing for us to learn from. So sorry, that's kind of two quite big questions, but
well, thanks for those. I mean, in terms of the first, I don't know of anybody who's done comparative work looking at the coerced debt enacted by France on Haiti, or then the compensation that was paid out by the British government to people who had owned other people. The thing that I would say is, and that the argument that I would wish to make in relation to this, is that one of the things that I'm trying to argue for in the present, building on the work obviously of scholar activists and others who've done a lot of this work over the last 200-300 years, is around the notion of post-colonial reparative action. And as soon as we talk about reparations, one of the things that comes about is that it's not possible, it's this, what all the arguments against reparations that exist. And my argument is that, well, actually we, and here I'm using the we as a European we have a tradition of reparations, and that tradition is a form of reparations for the loss of property. So within the European Enlightenment, within all traditions within Europe, there is a fundamental understanding that should you be deprived of your property, you would be recompensed for it. And we have that through the French and Haiti case, and we have that through the British slave owners case. So if we've been prepared to pay reparations for the loss of property when that property has been embodied in other human beings, why are we not prepared to pay for the loss of property from indigenous peoples, others, and so on? So we have a strong tradition of reparations. Let's not pretend this is anything other than reparations. So I think that would be a powerful argument to make, because what we would be doing is using the resources of the tradition itself to make the argument such that the argument doesn't exist outside of that tradition, it's part of it. I'm not saying this is the only thing to do, but it's another way of getting at the same sorts of things. Going on to the issue of race and citizenship, I think, and again, this is for me, but I see race as something that's produced through colonialism. So to the extent, so I would understand race as a structure of colonialism. And so the only way to have a post-race world is to transform those structures that have produced race, i.e. colonialism, in order to resolve the inequalities and injustices that have been created through them, such that we would then be able to think about what a world I mean, it's not to imagine a new world into being. I think that the only way to bring that world into being is to address and repair the wounds that have been created in the world that we currently have. So it's a slightly different way of getting at what you're talking about. And in that sense, I think that what the Haitian Constitution presents us with is, well, what it presents us with is people grappling with the injustices and inequalities that they've had to live with, and then thinking about how you address those inequalities without generating new inequalities in the process. And so that aspect of thinking about the ways in which Germans and Polish people and other white indentured labourers were not white in the same way as the French and the British were white, I think is incredibly revealing. And the way in which they insist on Black as a category as a way to, I think it's one of the most radically humanist sort of examples that one can point to, that in their assertion of a Black identity, what they're asserting is a radical humanity that's inclusive and refuses domination and subordination at the same time. So I think there's much, and there's a lot of work. I mean, some of the references that I've put in here, Anne Gulick's piece on the Haitian Constitution is excellent. I think Anna Julia Cooper's work is just fantastic. And, you know, she's the person who I was saying was the very early scholar to work on thinking about the French and Haitian examples, and sort of looking at her work and other people who've used her work. So Vivian May has written on Anna Julia Cooper's work and stuff as well. So those sorts of people do provide a lot of resources to thinking about these sorts of questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the bibliography, that's super. I'll explore that definitely.
So hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm sorry I was late. I just came from France actually, and I was looking at lots of pictures of Napoleon and all his golden furniture. So if you want to know where all that gold went, some of it went to gild his great amount of furniture. You know, I've been thinking a lot about something Gurminder writes about in Connected Sociologies, which is about engaging with difference in a way that makes a difference to what was originally thought. And this past year, the last year, was the first time I started teaching this example of the Haitian Revolution. So, and I had very little to go on, so this bibliography is fantastic. And I'll definitely, even though I'm not supposed to be doing any teaching this year, I am going to bone up on this and brush up on it. And what I tried to do is to combine it in a way that tries to make the difference to what was originally thought. So they start off with the Hochschild book on the kind of the abolition of slavery as a kind of white male triumph. Yeah. It's a very readable book, and it's fantastic. And then they find out about women's activism and you know, the anti-Saccharists, women's abolition. So women as consumers of sugar, not wanting to be involved in slavery. And then they do this book. They do a bit on the Haitian Revolution, and then they do a bit on this relatively new book by Lisa Tretto called The Myth of Seneca Falls. And it's really about that interplay between race and gender, and that this is there at the very beginning. But this does make the curriculum very complex. And it also messes with their minds, because it messes with, I always have quite a number of American students who take this, my module in the social and historical context of activism and advocacy. And so abolition is our kind of archetypal historical example of what advocacy and activism is all about. And then we bring it right up to the present with completely different types of campaigns. But we take threads from that. And the first thread I get from unraveling all these threads is quite a messy one, and this is really about the need to unthink race. And I think now that that is the real, what we need to engage with in a way that will make a difference to what is originally thought, to unthink race itself. But it's so difficult, Gurminder. I mean, you've gone a lot further down this road. So I don't know, it's not a very messy question, but I mean, how do you deal with that when you're in the classroom bringing a lot more complexity to the curriculum? Because I've just kind of dipped my toe in, tried out a few things this last year or so. And I do find that the students find it difficult. They don't find it too easy. And it also, because it also challenges their very precious meta-narrative about, you know, abolition and women's role and you know, how feminism and anti-racism are linked. But in this book, it shows that, in fact, that they're faced immediately, if slaves could be citizens, who should get the suffrage first, who should get the vote first. And then suddenly, you know, the posh white women back up and they go, well, obviously it should be us because we've got more education and we're white. So that, and then in order to you know, advance female suffrage, they have to take money from kind of known racists because, you know, they're the ones who can fund the campaign. So there's something there, a useful learning about strategy and tactics and resources for campaigning and all that as well. So anyway, that's a bit of a messy question, but how do we deal with the complexity? And, you know, I don't know what you think about my idea of, you know, is unthinking race the big thing, the one, if there was one big thing?
I mean, I think you're right that it is incredibly messy and it is incredibly complex. And the only way we can deal with the complexity and the messiness of it is to sort of put that front and center. And there are no easy sort of straightforward lines in relation to this. But one of the things that I try and do with the students when I'm teaching this stuff is in part to depersonalize it, because I make this distinction between the way, particularly within sociology, that we've often teach and think about issues of race is as identity or inequality, and inequality in the present. And I want to take a step back from that and say that whilst that, you know, there's a huge amount of work that has been done and is being done and is vitally important in thinking about race as identity and race as inequality, what I want to do is think about race as structure and think about the ways in which the world within which we live has been structured by race, where race is a colonial process. So it's colonization that produces our understandings of race, and it's colonization that produces a world based on racialized inequalities and hierarchies, which we've naturalized as the way that the world is. So it's about uncovering those processes which we don't give as much attention to in order to think about what difference it makes to things like the concept of citizenship. If we were to think about citizenship from the basis of the ways in which these structures have articulated our understandings of it. So in that sense, it becomes about the histories that have produced the world within which we live, not about issues of blame or guilt or shame or pride about any of this. That, for me, that has no place in the classroom. Those are things that students can discuss in other sorts of contexts, but I want them to know how the world has come into being. And
I find the work of Iris Marion Young really useful in this respect, when, you know, she is a great resource to help students think about the difference between responsibility and blame, and that they're not the same thing. You can be responsible without being blamed.
Right.
The different things. I do find that really, that book, Responsibility for Justice, is quite useful resource for that. But no, that's, I agree with you, basically. But yeah, anyway, let's see what else there is to discuss.
Anyone else? Otherwise, yeah, Scott, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Julia, and thank you, Professor Bhambra,
I think you may want to move closer to the microphone because we can't really understand you.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, it was a weird Bluetooth thing. Just in terms of your concept of the epistemic disavowal and what effect it would have on social science to center the Haitian Revolution, I work a bit well, mainly in the South African context, where critiques of liberalism are quite mainstream, and so a lot of our work would start with maybe with David Theo Goldberg's work on racial liberalism, and the way that liberalism has worked to reproduce white male power. One of the difficult things in trying to convince students and colleagues and people about the critique of liberalism is the idea that, well, it's just because there's nothing wrong with liberalism itself. There's nothing wrong with the ideas. There's nothing wrong with liberalism philosophically. The problem is that we haven't been doing it properly. And the history of the world since the revolutions has been a history of perfecting liberalism until we get to its essence, and that essence is still correct. So I was just wondering, to what extent do you think that kind of unequal property relationships and the structures of social hierarchies are hardwired almost into the ideas of liberalism, or is what we're trying to reclaim ultimately some kind of liberalism?
I mean, that's a difficult one, because it's almost like there's much more of a sort of commitment to the ideology of liberalism than dealing with the practicalities of it. So on one level, I guess where I would start is that if liberalism is an ideal which hasn't yet been fully perfected, then what has been in the way of the possibility of it being perfected? And is it that there have been obstacles in the way, or is it that the instantiation of liberalism is itself complicit in the establishment of the very inequalities that we then think of as being in the way of it? So to the extent, I was, because I was just working on this a little while ago, this idea of the more perfect union. So I was looking at Barack Obama's speech that he made, the classic speech that he made on race in the lead up to the first time when he was elected as president of the US. And he made a speech in which he talked about, well, what we're doing is to create a more perfect union. And it's like, and therefore we have to address racial inequality in our in the process of creating this more perfect union. But what he doesn't address is the fact that the union as it was created on a structural inequality which denied humanity to a significant proportion of the population. And the Constitution was predicated on that structural inequality. So he seemed to suggest that the Constitution in itself was a truly liberal document because within it, it included the ways in which we could address the problems that we were currently facing, but without taking into account that the Constitution itself was predicated on the exclusion of others. So you can't now include people into something from which they've been structurally excluded without fundamentally transforming the world, both materially and epistemologically. So it's not as if racial inequality in the US doesn't have a 200-year history that would require to be addressed. So you can't simply give people the vote and say, now you're included. You have to also deal with the structures which had excluded them for 200 years and exploited them for 200 years. And that material transformation would require reparations. So that's partly when I'm talking about undoing the epistemic disavowal. It's what I was saying before, that it's not just that we should take Haiti seriously, but how would taking Haiti seriously provoke us to act in the world in a way today that's different from how we acted in the past? So I'm not interested in saving liberalism or enacting liberalism. I'm interested in identifying what are the inequalities and injustices that disfigure our world. What are the historical processes that have produced those inequalities? And how do we need to act in the world today in order to address those inequalities and injustices? Not so that we can make up for the past, because the past is past, it's happened, but by addressing the legacies of that past, to enact a just future is the only way we can address the horrors of our past. You know, so it's this sort of, the only way, for me, the only way to create a better world is to make a change in the world we're currently in. And reparations has to be the central plank from which any future world is built. Because reparations both addresses historical inequalities, addresses their present instantiation, and in resolving those issues provides us with a way forward. I hope that sort of answers.
Yeah. Oh.
Can I just quickly add something about liberalism and that, well, obviously liberalism is better than illiberalism, like outright illiberalism. But there's also kind of a background teleology that we tend to accept, that things were illiberal before and they're getting more liberal now. And something I've tried to do in trying to understand like the history of where human rights came from is to see how much zigzagging, and this, you know, what's really interesting after the French Revolution is there's a moment when progressive ideas, you know, start bursting forward and emerging, and then very quickly you can't underestimate how much conservatism is there and how powerful it is, and how they take up I use this kind of metaphor of this rope where all the left-wing strands were all taken up by right-handed people and wound in a right-handed sort of thread of narrative and remade history in this kind of right-leaning way. So I don't think you'd ever underestimate the importance of restoration of conservatism and of, you know, illiberalism. And I think there's a sort of an abstract or theoretical assumption that, you know, well, things were illiberal in the past and they're going to become more liberal in the future. And I think that history has basically shown that that is just not true.
Gurminder, do you want to respond or just take that? Yeah. I actually wanted to add on what you said with regard to reparative justice, because I've always viewed Haiti pretty much as the, you know, the textbook case of colonial continuations of all kinds of, you know, engagements, but mostly, I mean, obviously, very obviously in terms of development, because that's what I have focused about. And I would argue that it's a very active silencing. So and of course I would agree that, you know, this de-silencing is absolutely necessary. But in my view, it's a very deliberate act of silencing, because I mean, back then the Haitian case was a danger, and that's why France and the US and all other colonial powers were so afraid and so keen on, you know, holding the new republic down, because they were afraid of the domino effect. And I think essentially it's the same now, because if we were to acknowledge, we again, you know, as Europeans or whatever, if we were to acknowledge the relevance of the Haitian Revolution and the Haitian case as such, then obviously there would be no other way than to pay reparation and to try and make it up somehow. So and that's why I think the way Haiti is framed in development discourse, it's like the continuation of that very the silencing basically of something that hasn't happened and that is not relevant, and still the very colonial perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that, but at the same time as sort of recognizing the active silencing that's gone on and by whom, one of the things that we should also keep in mind is that who has remembered the Haitian Revolution? Because in a sense, the only way we know about it today is because it has been kept alive in many sorts of ways. And so when I first encountered the Haitian Revolution, one of the ways in which I framed understanding it was this whole notion of silencing, you know, the silencing of the Haitian Revolution. And then discovered, well, actually, it was a central part of the Harlem Renaissance. It was a central part of Latin American movements for independence. It was a central part of, as Robbie Shulliam has sort of noted, you know, the Maoris in New Zealand were aware of the Haitian Revolution. So colonized and subjugated peoples around the world certainly knew about the Haitian Revolution. And the very reason to silence it was precisely to stop it being, you know, this sort of like the containing of a contagion against the possibility of the spread of revolts by enslaved people in the southern states of the US and elsewhere. And so there's that double thing there. Yes, who has the interest in trying to silence it? And who has an interest in remembering it? And what can we do in our remembering of it to not just reify it, but to make it live within the disciplines that we're involved in?
Well, and in fact, I mean, you have Haitian kids singing these songs and chants on, you know, the heroes of the revolution. And yet at the same time, there's this discourse about denying Haitian agency. There's, you know, there's no social, they're completely helpless. There's this need to intervene. So yeah, I mean, who is an interest? And I guess the interest of those who continue to intervene are much more powerful than those voices. We're close to 4 o'clock. Is there anyone else who has a burning issue to raise, a question or a comment? So with that, please join me in thanking Gurminder for this talk and lots of food for thought. And you've already said that that will definitely appear in some teaching next semester. So that's a very good thing. So thanks very much. And I would already like to invite you to the next